The plantation sat beyond the reach of ordinary roads, enclosed on three sides by marshland that behaved like an unpredictable border, shifting with the seasons and swallowing any path not reinforced by constant foot traffic. The enslaved workers moved through this landscape with a mixture of weary familiarity and calculated caution, aware that a misstep into a soft patch of mud or the roots of a submerged cypress could lead to injury, lost time, and punishment that ignored the hazards of the terrain. Overseers, meanwhile, treated the marsh as a hostile feature rather than the living boundary it was, relying on crude maps and patrol paths that never seemed to match the land's slow rearrangements. This contrast shaped the rhythm of daily labor, the workers adapting themselves to a place that did not reward carelessness, the officials insisting on routines that made little sense in terrain dominated by water, insects, and shifting ground. At dawn each morning, tasks were assigned with mechanical formality: cutting cane, tending rice paddies flooded up to the knee, transporting tools along narrow levees. And the hierarchy was reinforced through constant surveillance, as though order itself could be maintained by repetition even when the environment resisted every command given to it. Marcellus was recognized within this structure not through his voice or personal history, but through the precision of his movements and the way he navigated the margins of the property where the marsh thickened into a maze of shallow pools and cypress roots. Other workers watched him with a mixture of caution and reliance, because his survival instincts were the product of experience rather than superstition or rumor. The overseers interpreted his competence in the marsh as a form of useful labor, assigning him to tasks involving boundary inspection, retrieval of tools accidentally dropped in deep water, or guiding patrols who feared getting lost when the vegetation grew too thick. His reputation emerged from actions: the steady way he tested the ground with a stick before taking a step, the quick, quiet assessment he made of tree growth, water coloration, and bird movements to detect hazards, the methodical pace he maintained even when pressured to move faster. His past appeared only in fragments known to a few: an early life near a coastal swamp, a childhood marked by tasks adults avoided, a scar on his forearm reportedly earned while retrieving a trapped mule from a flooded ditch. These fragments supplied context, but never formed a complete biography, because the plantation environment defined him more than any personal story he once carried. The social layers of the plantation pressed against one another with constant friction. White officials, overseers, bookkeepers, traveling inspectors competed for authority through demonstrations of discipline, often issuing contradictory orders that confused workers and irritated one another. Enslaved laborers formed quiet alliances based on skill, temperament, and necessity. Informants existed within this system as unstable elements, attempting to preserve their own safety by reporting minor infractions or suspicions, yet their status remained precarious. While overseers valued them for information, they also distrusted them for the same reason. Marsh patrollers, responsible for tracking movement near the water's edge, viewed the marsh as a territory outside their competence and resented anyone who appeared more comfortable in it. Marcellus's steady presence in the wetlands made him a focal point of both curiosity and unease, as he seemed to bridge the gap between the plantation's rigid structure and the marsh's fluid, unpredictable order. Daily routines produced tension through repetition. The landowners visited infrequently, but issued strict mandates regarding production quotas, leading overseers to escalate punishments when weather, flooding, or soil conditions interfered with work. Rice paddies required constant maintenance, and the draining or flooding of fields involved a dangerous coordination of levee gates, manual pumps, and labor conducted in stagnant water known to cause sickness. Sugar processing demanded long hours near boiling vats, where heat and noise created an atmosphere of disorientation. Every task involved risk aggravated by oversight that prioritized discipline over safety. The marsh amplified these pressures. Tools sank into hidden pools, supply paths eroded, animals disrupted fences and irrigation systems during storms. Order existed only at the surface level, sustained by force, but constantly undermined by the land itself. Suspicion began to rise during the late summer season when heat and humidity thickened the air and reduced visibility in the swampy areas. A low-ranking plantation inspector assigned to conduct random perimeter checks failed to return after venturing toward the marsh. His absence initially produced irritation rather than alarm among the officials, who attributed his delay to incompetence or drunkenness. A group of overseers traced his last known route, following trampled grass and shallow footprints that faded near a stand of cypress trees. The search revealed no sign of struggle or accident, only a set of scattered tool marks near the waterline and a single boot half submerged in mud, distorted from prolonged exposure to moisture. The disappearance was inconvenient but not unprecedented. Marshland accidents occurred often enough for officials to rationalize the event without investigating further. Workers, however, exchanged glances marked by subtle recognition, sensing that the inspector's path had been unusual and that something deliberate might have influenced it. Marcellus entered the pattern of suspicion unobtrusively. He was observed near the perimeter earlier that same day, completing a task assigned to him, clearing debris from a drainage channel after a brief storm. The overseer supervising him noted that Marcellus finished the work efficiently and returned toward the fields without hesitation. Yet whispers circulated among the enslaved laborers that the inspector had been seen speaking with a known informant the day before, asking questions about workers who spent time near the marsh. This context, combined with Marcellus's proximity to the area, created a quiet undercurrent of unease. No one accused him directly, but the coincidence became a point of attention for those who monitored even minor irregularities. The disappearance triggered a shift in behavior rather than immediate consequences. Overseers increased perimeter checks, though their distrust of the marsh limited how far they ventured. Marsh patrollers were ordered to inspect deeper areas despite their reluctance, leading to half-hearted searches conducted along familiar routes that avoided the more unstable ground. Informants attempted to leverage the situation by offering theories designed to protect themselves, suggesting that someone might have misled the inspector or that a concealed path existed which workers used for illicit meetings. None of these claims produced actionable evidence, but they intensified the sense of surveillance and heightened tension across the plantation. Meanwhile, workers began adjusting their routines subtly to account for the new conditions of suspicion. They remained closer to groups, avoided lingering near the marsh unless assigned to it, and monitored overseers' behavior for signs of impending discipline. Marcellus adopted a more measured posture, reducing the amount of time he spent near the water except when necessary. His movements became increasingly deliberate, as though he anticipated that any action taken in the marsh could be misinterpreted. The environment he understood so well now served both as a resource and a liability, an expanse that could conceal footprints but could also amplify scrutiny. The farm structures themselves, storage sheds, processing barns, quarters, reflected the strain produced by the disappearance. Lock mechanisms were inspected more frequently, food rations were distributed with extra supervision, and nighttime restrictions tightened. Workers sensed that the officials were searching not for the inspector, but for signs of disobedience or hidden plans. This approach reflected the broader reality of plantation life. Every unexplained incident was interpreted through the lens of control rather than concern. The absence of the inspector became a symbol of disorder, prompting measures intended to reinforce authority at the expense of reason. Rumors grew around the circumstances as days passed without resolution. Some workers speculated that the inspector suffered an accident, falling into a deep pocket of mud that concealed him completely. Others believed he strayed from the path after sunset and succumbed to exhaustion or exposure. A few whispered theories approached closer to the underlying tension, that someone had intentionally guided him into dangerous ground, using the marsh's deceptive stability to ensure he would not return. These murmurs never developed into accusations, partly because such ideas risked severe punishment, and partly because the workers understood that the marsh itself could serve as both accomplice and explanation without requiring supernatural interpretation or open conspiracy. The officials' response eventually moved from irritated dismissal to guarded concern when a second incident occurred. A marsh patroller reported that one of their boundary stakes had been relocated by several yards, disrupting the route used to measure the property edge. Although the stake could have been displaced by natural forces, flooding, animal activity, or decay, overseers interpreted the movement as a potential act of sabotage. They questioned workers involved in recent marsh-related tasks, restricting Marcellus's access to the area unless directly supervised. This measure appeared practical on the surface, but revealed an unspoken suspicion that he might possess too much familiarity with a landscape the officials could not control. Marcellus responded by maintaining a consistent pattern of behavior that avoided drawing attention, performing assigned duties without variation, keeping interactions brief and focused on work, and avoiding any behaviors that could be interpreted as concealment. Internally, however, he observed the officials with sharpened awareness, noting which overseers reacted with anger, which informants grew nervous, and which marsh patrollers avoided patrol routes more than before. The disappearance of the inspector had created an imbalance within the plantation's power structure, exposing vulnerabilities usually hidden beneath the rigid daily order. Marcellus recognized that this imbalance offered both danger and opportunity, though he did not yet act upon it. By the end of the initial week following the disappearance, the plantation existed in a state of restrained tension. The landowners remained unaware, occupied with distant business matters, while the overseers attempted to re-establish control through stricter routines. Workers felt the weight of increased surveillance, but also sensed a shift beneath it, a recognition that the marsh, which had always been treated as a hostile boundary, had now become a factor the officials could not easily interpret or command. This shift did not yet manifest in open conflict, but it introduced a layer of uncertainty that framed every task and interaction. The first spark of the central conflict emerged not from a dramatic event, but from the convergence of these subtle pressures. The disappearance, the relocated stake, the heightened surveillance, the growing suspicion toward Marcellus, and the uneasy silence shared among workers all combined to create a situation in which ordinary routines no longer felt predictable. The marsh, once an inconvenience or a place of labor, now carried the implication of selective danger, danger understood by some and feared by others. Marcellus stood at the center of this developing pattern, shaped by the land, yet constrained by the system, beginning to sense that the forces pressing against him could eventually require choices he could not reverse. The disappearance of the inspector did not fade into the background as the overseers had hoped. Instead, it became a silent weight shaping every action on the plantation. Surveillance intensified in a way that was both sudden and poorly coordinated, revealing underlying tensions among the officials themselves. Patrol routes multiplied but overlapped chaotically, with overseers issuing contradictory instructions. One ordered workers to remain closer to the fields. Another demanded that the marsh perimeter be inspected twice as often, and yet another insisted that workers avoid the marsh entirely except when given explicit orders. This inconsistency created confusion that was punished rather than corrected. The workers, sensing how easily such confusion could be turned against them, moved with heightened caution, measuring their gestures and silence against the unpredictable expectations of those in charge. The officials' attempts to reassert authority through sheer pressure only demonstrated how frayed their internal structure had become, and the Marsh, the place none of them trusted, functioned as an unspoken threat underlying every decision. Interrogations began quietly, but escalated rapidly. Workers called into storage sheds or corn cribs for questioning emerged shaken, not because the overseers possessed new information, but because the interrogations were conducted as though guilt could be forced into existence through persistence. Questions focused on movements near the marsh, on who had last seen the inspector, on what might have motivated a worker to mislead him. Informants, previously confident in their limited protection, grew restless under the pressure, realizing that offering information no longer guaranteed safety when the officials themselves could not agree on what they wanted to hear. Some informants attempted to shift suspicion toward rivals or isolated workers, while others withdrew entirely, avoiding contact with overseers whenever possible. Their instability fed the tension among the enslaved community, as alliances that had once formed naturally around shared tasks began reorganizing around trust, caution, and the ability to remain unnoticed. Marcellus found himself positioned at the center of scrutiny again, though no overseer openly accused him. His proximity to the marsh and the stake incident created a quiet, persistent suspicion, motivating overseers to watch him with a focused vigilance they struggled to maintain elsewhere. Every movement he made was evaluated for irregularity. The duration of time he spent near water, the direction he walked when transitioning between tasks, the pace of his work relative to others. This pressure did not cause him to retreat, but instead forced him to refine his behavior, calculating each action not just for safety, but for perception. He avoided the marsh except when ordered into it, and even then he moved at a steady, unhurried pace meant to signal compliance rather than skill. He also limited his interactions with other workers so as not to implicate them and avoided informants entirely, recognizing that their unpredictable behavior posed more risk than the overseers. The system-wide tension also produced fractures among overseers. Some believed the inspector's disappearance was an accident, attributing it to the marsh's inherent danger and the man's lack of experience. Others suspected that the workers had coordinated something, seeing in the disappearance evidence of organized defiance. This disagreement surfaced during inspections, as one overseer might attempt to escalate disciplinary measures while another insisted on reinforcing routine without provoking unrest. Their inability to present a unified strategy signaled to the enslaved workers that authority was weakening, even if that weakness could not be safely acknowledged. Marsh patrollers, resentful of being forced into deeper terrain, expressed open frustration, claiming the land itself was the cause of these problems and that no human intervention was necessary to explain the inspector's fate. Their reluctance created logistical gaps in surveillance, widening the very vulnerabilities the overseers hoped to control. Rumors among the enslaved community shifted from fearful speculation to careful analysis. Some workers believed someone had used the marsh's instability to guide the inspector into danger, noting that natural accidents rarely left such ambiguous traces. Others focused on the stake's relocation, interpreting it as a deliberate disruption meant to mislead patrols or confuse property boundaries. These discussions did not occur openly. They formed in the spaces between assigned tasks, exchanged through brief gestures or remarks that conveyed concern without inviting suspicion. The marsh became a symbol of possibility as much as danger, a landscape that could serve as a shield or a trap, depending on who understood it. Marcellus's connection to it became a subject of quiet respect and quiet fear, as workers recognized that his knowledge could serve as protection but could equally implicate him, if the plantation officials concentrated their suspicions in his direction. Restrictions hardened as the overseers attempted to regain control. Nighttime movements were reduced to a narrow window between work hours and sleep, monitored by increased patrols who were themselves nervous about venturing too close to the marsh in darkness. Tools were locked away, counted twice daily, and distributed only under supervision. Food rations were inspected before distribution and after consumption, as though contraband could be hidden in cornmeal or rice. Workers assigned to marsh-adjacent tasks were selected more carefully and rotated frequently to avoid the appearance of favoritism or reliance. These measures, however, had the opposite effect. They highlighted the planter society's fear of the marsh, turning routine tasks into potential flashpoints for punishment or accusation. The oppressive heat, combined with long days and constant surveillance, created an atmosphere where minor mistakes, an overlooked tool, a misplaced basket, a missed signal, were interpreted as deliberate acts of resistance. Throughout this escalation, Marcellus's motivations and fears emerged not through internal monologues, but through his actions. He shielded younger workers by taking on the more dangerous edges of tasks when possible, stepping into mud pockets first to test stability, or guiding others away from paths he knew to be risky. He avoided involvement in the more volatile conversations among the enslaved community, understanding that speculation could be misinterpreted as planning. When ordered into the marsh to retrieve a dropped tool, he complied with controlled precision, neither demonstrating his full competence nor feigning ignorance. He moved just enough to complete the task while revealing nothing. His restraint revealed a fear grounded in experience, the fear that competence itself could become incriminating. At the same time, his strategic choices suggested a deeper motivation, a desire to maintain the marsh as a leverage point, a place where he could influence outcomes even under surveillance if necessary. The fractures among plantation characters widened when another incident threatened the fragile balance. A levee gate near the rice fields jammed unexpectedly during an inspection, causing water levels to rise beyond what the overseers considered acceptable. One overseer accused workers of tampering with the mechanism, while another insisted that the swelling river was to blame. The argument between them grew sharp enough that workers nearby sensed their rivalry, concluding in punitive action. Marcellus, recognizing the danger, stepped forward to examine the mechanism under the guise of assisting with labor. His steady hands and familiarity with waterlogged equipment allowed him to identify the obstruction quickly, a buildup of silt lodged behind the gate. But he presented the finding in a way that attributed the problem to natural causes rather than human interference. By doing so, he prevented immediate punishment for the workers present and reduced the likelihood of collective discipline. But he also drew additional suspicion simply by demonstrating competence under stress. Informants struggled under the rising pressure. Some attempted to fabricate stories to appease overseers, creating unreliable narratives that contradicted one another. These contradictions revealed fractures in their credibility, leading overseers to suspect them rather than rely on them. Informants who had once positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries began avoiding both workers and officials, retreating into uneasy isolation. Their nervous behavior, glancing frequently toward the marsh, avoiding eye contact, minimizing movement outside assigned tasks, triggered new rumors, not all of which were inaccurate. Workers speculated that informants feared retribution not from overseers, but from someone who understood the marsh and could use it with precision. This suspicion returned repeatedly to Marcellus, though no one voiced it aloud, both out of respect for his silence and out of recognition that articulating it could endanger everyone. As pressure mounted, the conflict became impossible to ignore. Overseers implemented a new rule requiring any worker assigned to marsh tasks to move in pairs, believing that mutual observation would prevent sabotage. This decision backfired when pairs began forming alliances shaped by mutual trust or shared fear, strengthening relationships that might otherwise have remained superficial. Some workers developed coordinated strategies to avoid unnecessary exposure, subtly signaling to one another when patrols approached or when additional caution was needed. These alliances were not the beginnings of a rebellion, but rather attempts to survive within a system that punished unpredictably and interpreted misunderstanding as defiance. Overseers noted these formations but misread them as evidence of organized resistance, further escalating their paranoia. Marcellus faced his first irreversible choice during a late afternoon assignment that required him to guide a pair of younger workers toward a shallow water channel where overgrown vegetation had begun obstructing drainage. The overseers expected him to move directly through the marsh along a familiar route, but recent shifts in the waterline had created a deep, concealed pool along that path, one that could easily swallow a person who misjudged its depth. Marcellus knew that following the overseer's instructions would place the younger workers at risk, yet deviating from the path could be interpreted as defiance or concealment. He chose a third option. He slowed the pace of travel and altered the route subtly while maintaining the appearance of following the prescribed direction. This decision required calculated risk, as he had to judge distance, timing, and visibility with precision. The workers behind him sensed the danger only through the tension in his posture and followed without question, aware that their safety depended on his understanding of the terrain. They reached the drainage channel without incident, but the slight delay in their return attracted scrutiny from an overseer who interpreted the detour as possible misdirection. This began a new pattern of targeted questioning and surveillance focused on Marcellus alone. This moment marked the first step Marcellus could not undo. By choosing to protect the younger workers rather than adhere strictly to overseer orders, he revealed his willingness to manipulate the marsh under controlled conditions. While his action remained subtle enough to avoid overt detection, it signaled to him that the marsh could still be used as a form of agency, even under heavy watch. It also demonstrated that survival sometimes required active decision-making rather than passive endurance. The marsh was no longer merely a place of labor. It had become a tool, one that Marcellus understood intimately enough to wield when necessary. This realization, though quiet and internal, reshaped his perception of the unfolding situation, setting the stage for choices that would carry far deeper consequences. By the end of this period, the plantation's internal structure exhibited cracks visible to anyone paying attention. Overseers disagreed openly, informants faltered under scrutiny, marsh patrollers avoided their duties whenever possible, and the enslaved workers formed networks of trust shaped by necessity rather than open cooperation. The disappearance, once an isolated event, now influenced every decision, every assignment, every subtle shift in behavior. Tension permeated the fields, the quarters, and the marsh boundary, creating an environment where even minor actions produced significant reactions. Marcellus moved within this pressure as both subject and observer, neither confronting the system directly nor surrendering entirely to its demands. His choices began to shape the marsh's role in the conflict, guiding it from a passive landscape to an active force aligned with his understanding of justice, survival, and the limits imposed upon him. The weeks following the second disappearance were recorded with a nervous, unsteady hand in the surviving ledgers, each page marked not by ink alone, but by the tremor of whoever held the pen. Observers noted that the plantation, once governed by the slow, punishing regularity of the season's rhythms, now moved in a pattern that resembled fever more than order. Patrols doubled, torches burned late into the night. The overseers, no longer confident in the authority of their own voices, relied on the noise of weapons struck deliberately against doorframes, rails, and fence posts to announce their presence. The marsh boundary, once dismissed as the natural perimeter beyond which no sensible man would tread, had become the source of an unspoken, pulsing dread. A smell of rot drifted from its direction, stronger than before, though the marsh had always carried such scents. Many noted the change, yet insisted it must be imagination, for the air in that place had never been sweet. Still, the overseers avoided looking toward it for longer than a few seconds, as if the act of sustained attention could draw something unwanted closer. The consequences of the disappearances, which at first seemed like isolated anomalies, began to reorganize the plantation's social anatomy. In earlier eras, discipline had served as a system of predictable punishment, functioning like a dark version of clockwork. The crime imagined, the response administered, the day resumed. But the new atmosphere broke the mechanical certainty. Now punishments arrived without pattern, not as responses, but as anticipations, as if authority felt the need to strike before anything else could slip from its grasp. The record of 1 week alone listed 47 separate infractions, many of which lacked clear descriptions, and several observers commented that the handwriting changed between names, suggesting multiple authors and no single mind directing the campaign. The result was not order, but volatility. Rumors spread that an enslaved boy had been whipped merely for pausing on the path, and though no corroborating documents survive, the rumor's rapid spread was destructive enough to be taken as its own truth. People walked faster, heads bowed not from submission, but from the need to conceal their thoughts. In the quarters at night, small gatherings dissolved the instant a lantern light flickered across a distant wall, and individuals began to sleep in rotations, convinced that something, either patrollers or marsh-born apparitions, was testing the walls for weaknesses. Testimonies mentioned this period as one in which loyalties were peeled back to reveal something raw beneath. Those previously trusted to carry messages or share warnings now found their motives questioned. A woman known for her reliability in passing word between cabins became suddenly evasive, and though no accusation was made formally, many later claimed she had been threatened during one of the overseer's late-night interrogations. Some said she carried bruises hidden beneath her headscarf. Others insisted she had turned informant willingly to protect her children. The record does not clarify, and she herself vanishes from documentation by winter. In contrast, individuals who had once seemed timid revealed unexpected resilience. A man whose silence had long been interpreted as fear became the quiet nucleus of small resistance actions, redirecting tools, hiding food, arranging subtle signals. None of these actions changed the larger momentum of events, but the shift in character roles fractured the plantation's brittle hierarchy further. People began reassessing whom they could trust, but trust itself had become an unstable currency. Marcellus moved through this atmosphere with a weight that contemporaries described not as fear, but as a deep, internal counting, an awareness that each action and inaction carried consequences that accumulated like debts. The diary fragment attributed to one of the patrollers, later found in a water-damaged chest, noted that Marcellus's posture had changed. He no longer walked along the predictable paths, but moved at angles, as if measuring routes invisible to others. Observers among the enslaved population noticed that he often paused near the marsh's edge at dusk, staring into the reeds long enough that the outlines of his figure blurred with the shifting shadows. Some believed he was waiting for a signal. Others feared he had begun communicating with whatever presence resided within the waterlogged depths. Still others insisted he stood there only to think, for no man could plan anything substantial within the quarters anymore, not with informants circulating and overseers prowling. The plantation administration, overwhelmed by a sense that the order of things had slipped from their grasp, initiated a new measure of discipline, collective punishment. The logbook for that month records the burning of an outbuilding after a missing tool was blamed on seditious negligence, though witness accounts suggest the tool was later found buried in mud near the north field. Entire groups were ordered to kneel in the yard while overseers paced in front of them, announcing that someone among them knew more than they were saying. Children cried until their throats were hoarse. Adults bowed their heads not to show obedience, but to shield the younger ones from the sight of drawn weapons. The intention had been to force confessions regarding the disappearances, but no confessions came, and in the absence of answers the overseers intensified their efforts. Night interrogations multiplied. Lanterns moved like restless eyes across the settlement. Every sound past midnight was interpreted as a potential escape, attack, or haunting. Amid this pressure, Marcellus made his decisive turn. Scholars note that this moment marks the shift from reactive survival to intentional action. Unlike earlier acts, warning others, hiding evidence, delaying searches, this decision bore the imprint of finality. According to the reconstructed testimonies, he approached two specific men among the overseers, both known for their brutality and their eagerness to impress the superintendent. He spoke with them in a controlled manner, neither submissive nor confrontational, and offered to guide them to what he described as a suspicious site. They believed he had finally yielded to fear or exhaustion. They followed him willingly. The details of what happened next come from three accounts: the statement of a field hand who witnessed the group departing, the archived complaint of a patroller who later searched for the missing overseers, and the marginal notes scribbled in a personal journal that survived only because it had been hidden under floorboards. Together, they form a jagged but coherent sequence. Marcellus led the men not toward the fields or the quarters but toward the marsh border, a place that even the most hardened patrollers avoided after sunset. The overseers, confident yet irritated by the terrain, followed reluctantly, complaining about the mud and insects. The witness who saw them go claimed that the reeds seemed to swallow the group faster than natural, as if the marsh itself absorbed their outlines. What occurred within that darkness remains partly speculative. The patroller's complaint states that when he later inspected the marsh's edge, he found disturbed ground, broken reeds, and what appeared to be drag marks leading deeper into the bog. The journal's marginalia adds that Marcellus returned alone long after midnight, covered in mud up to his chest, his face expressionless except for a faint tremor around the mouth. No screams had been heard, no alarm raised. The overseers simply vanished into the marsh, adding their names to the growing list of unaccounted-for individuals. The immediate aftermath of this event carved a deeper fracture across the plantation's social body. Suspicion erupted not only among the authorities, who now sensed that the disappearances were not random, but also among the enslaved, who realized the stakes of involvement had escalated beyond even the cruel punishments previously known. The risk of being connected, even distantly, to Marcellus's actions became a source of silent terror. Some individuals avoided him entirely, stepping aside in pathways or retreating indoors when he approached. Others gravitated toward him, interpreting his act as the first decisive strike in a long-awaited reckoning. The split was not ideological but instinctual, those who feared the consequences and those who believed consequences were inevitable regardless of action. Authority responded with a mixture of panic and escalating brutality. New patrol routes were drawn that circled the marsh repeatedly, though few men willingly completed those circuits. Harsh discipline was emphasized in daily orders, with supervisors encouraged to demonstrate visible firmness to counter growing unrest. The superintendent issued a series of directives requiring more searches of sleeping quarters, more surveillance during work hours, and more interrogations at sunset. The records show that these measures produced little useful information but generated significant injury. One entry lists 14 individuals injured during compliance procedures, though witness accounts suggest the real number was nearer 30. Fear thickened the air until even the innocuous sounds of nightly wildlife, the croaking of frogs, the sudden movement of a heron, were interpreted as signs of further catastrophe. The psychological strain manifested most intensely in the loss recorded later that month, a young woman who collapsed during field labor and did not rise again. Official documents cited exhaustion exacerbated by heat, but several witnesses described her as having lived in a state of unrelenting dread during the weeks leading up to her death, convinced that the Marsh was hungry for more than overseers. Her passing struck the quarters with a grief that was both personal and communal, sharpening the moral tension at the story's center. Was Marcellus acting out of protection, vengeance, or a desperation that blurred those lines beyond recognition? Her death forced many to contemplate whether the chain of events, disappearances, retaliation, violence, had reached a point where every choice was a step toward loss. Marcellus himself appeared to undergo an internal shift following the incident in the marsh. His movements became more controlled, as though he recognized that he had crossed a threshold beyond which retreat was impossible. Some describe him as haunted, others as resolute. The differences in testimony reflect the fragmented perception of those around him. At times he was seen helping repair a damaged cabin wall, his hands moving with steady precision. At other times he stood alone at the marsh's edge for long periods, unblinking, as if listening to something distant. The duality of his behavior became part of the plantation's murmured mythology. Children whispered that he could speak to the marsh. Adults insisted he had simply chosen a path from which no man returned unchanged. The plantation's landscape itself began to feel altered, not in physical structure, but in meaning. The fields seemed narrower, the paths heavier beneath the feet, the forest less a boundary than a lurking witness. The marsh grew into a presence that dominated thought even when unseen. Its reeds rustled in the slightest wind, their movement interpreted as a kind of communication. The water pooled in shapes that resembled footprints or handprints. There were nights when the fog rolled out farther than usual, curling around doorways like a probing hand. And though this may have been natural, the timing, a sequence of nights following Marcellus's decisive act, caused many to believe it was a response. As the final weeks of this escalation unfolded, the plantation fell into a pattern of alternating paralysis and frenzy. Days passed in tense labor under the eyes of increasingly frantic overseers. Nights became arenas for whispered warnings, hurried preparations, and silent prayers. The sense that something irreversible was approaching settled into every mind. The moral center of the story, the question of whether Marcellus had acted to protect the many or condemn them to greater danger, grew sharper with each new incident of punishment or loss. Individuals found themselves pulled inward, forced to evaluate not only what they believed, but what they were willing to endure. The plantation's fragile equilibrium was breaking, and each crack in its structure carried the promise of a greater rupture to come. By the time the superintendent ordered the largest marsh search in the plantation's history, the stage was set for confrontation. The very air felt anticipatory, as though the environment itself recognized that the conflict, long simmering in shadows and whispers, was now cresting toward its inevitable climax. The superintendent's command to conduct a full-scale marsh search marked the moment when the plantation's long-moving catastrophe finally rose to the surface with unmistakable force. Surviving documents record that the order was issued in a tone described by one clerk as strained beyond authority, as though the official himself understood that whatever lived in the marsh, whether human rebellion, supernatural terror, or a convergence of both, was no longer something that could be managed through administrative procedures. Yet he persisted, gathering patrols, requisitioning lanterns and torches, and ordering men from nearby estates to assist, their arrival documented by terse signatures on borrowed ledger paper. The preparation consumed a full day, though the urgency of the order made the delay feel like a kind of suspended breath. By dusk, a column of 33 men stood at the Marsh boundary, their posture rigid, their faces pulled tight by a mixture of fear and obligation. The superintendent's intention was unmistakable: force an answer into existence, regardless of the cost. The Marsh, however, responded with indifference. Each step the search party took sank into the landscape, as though absorbed by a patient organism. Accounts described the ground trembling beneath the weight of multiple men, not with seismic force, but with the slow yielding of soil too wet to resist. Several patrollers remarked that the temperature seemed to drop abruptly as they entered the reeds, though the night was otherwise mild. Lantern lights flickered in ways that scribes later attributed to wind, though no witness could recall feeling a breeze. The reeds, tall and dense, pressed inward around the men, their hollow stalks rasping against clothing and skin with a sound recorded in one report as persistent and close, like an animal's breath. The psychological effect was immediate. A number of men hesitated within the first 10 paces. Another refused to advance further and was threatened with dismissal. The superintendent, anxious to assert control, ordered everyone forward, yet his own stride faltered in several witness accounts, the reeds brushing his coat as if to remind him that authority held no dominion here. The search progressed in widening arcs, each circle meant to sweep the marsh systematically, though the terrain sabotaged this intention. Pools as the search party advanced deeper, the reeds behind them closed with soft finality, creating the illusion, or perhaps the reality, of sealing the men inside. Panic broke fully when one of the distant clusters failed to return after a scheduled signal. Lantern light from their group blinked twice, then vanished entirely. Shouts carried through the marsh, though echoes warped their direction, making it unclear whether the sounds were coming from the missing men or from something else entirely. The superintendent ordered a regrouping, but several men ignored him, retreating toward what they believed was the entrance, only to find the reeds rearranged in disorienting patterns. More lanterns failed. One torch sputtered and went out, releasing a hiss that silenced the entire column for several seconds. The darkness that followed was not complete. Moonlight filtered weakly through the reeds, but it was fragmented, shifting, unreliable. The men stood in it with the stiff tension of prey listening for footsteps. In this atmosphere of collapsing order, Marcellus stepped into the marsh. Witnesses could not agree on the exact moment he entered, but several recall seeing his silhouette blend with the reeds as naturally as if he were part of them. Those closest to the boundary claimed he moved without hesitation, though the mud accepted his weight differently from that of the search party, less like a trap and more like a surface accustomed to him. This observation appears in 3 separate testimonies, suggesting it was more than an invention. What he intended to do remains unknown, but his presence acted as a fulcrum around which events pivoted sharply. The superintendent, catching sight of him, ordered the men to seize him. This is documented with certainty, but the order did not reach all clusters, and those who heard it moved reluctantly, slowed by fear and terrain. Marcellus's form slipped deeper into the reeds, vanishing into a darkness that seemed to fold around him. What followed is preserved not in clean administrative documents, but in fragments, torn ledger pages, charred report remains, oral accounts transcribed decades later. Together they suggest that the marsh responded to the intrusion of the search party with escalating force. Men reported sudden drops beneath their feet where solid ground had existed moments earlier. One claimed the water rose in a surge that soaked him to the waist, though no other witness confirmed this. Another described a sound, like many bodies moving at once, unseen. A report initially dismissed, but later reconsidered after multiple men repeated similar impressions. The reeds shook violently in areas untouched by the search party. A man screamed, though the reason for his terror was never recovered. His body was not found. Panic became uncontainable as clusters disintegrated, individuals pushing through the marsh in desperate attempts to escape, their movements splashing, thrashing, creating further disorientation. Lanterns fell and were extinguished in mud. The marsh, once a boundary, became a labyrinth. Marcellus's exact role in this culminative chaos occupies the heart of the surviving narrative. Some testimonies claim he guided certain men towards safer ground, saving lives. Others insist he lured the most brutal overseers deeper into the marsh, ensuring they met the same end as those before. A few accounts, whispered with reverence or fear depending on the teller, suggest that he moved in ways the terrain should not have allowed, stepping where others sank, appearing in one place, and then another with unnatural speed. These descriptions are often dismissed as embellishment born of terror, yet their recurrence in multiple unrelated sources gives them an unsettling weight. What is clear is that Marcellus acted with deliberation, not frenzy. He made choices within the chaos, choices that shaped the fates of those around him. The superintendent's fate is recorded only in implication. His signature appears on documents dated the day before the search. No record of him exists afterward. A later inventory noted his absence with the neutral phrase status unresolved, a term often used when the truth was too costly to state openly. Oral tradition asserts that he drowned in the marsh, pulled under by mud that closed instantly above him. One account claims he was last seen reaching toward Marcellus, his arm outstretched in accusation or plea. Another insists the marsh took him without witnesses, swallowing him silently. The lack of consensus reinforces the central reality. He was gone, and with him the plantation's remaining semblance of administrative power fragmented entirely. By dawn, the marsh released its survivors. They emerged not as a search party, but as individuals scattered across the boundary, coated in mud, trembling with exhaustion, several unable to speak coherently. Their weapons were missing. Their lanterns were gone. Their boots were half sucked away by the bog. Many carried injuries inconsistent with simple falls, deep scratches, torn sleeves, bruises shaped like pressure rather than impact. The plantation physician attempted to categorize these wounds, but later gave up, noting only that the men suffered from extreme nervous shock. The marsh had not killed them all, but it had broken something within them, a certainty or arrogance that could not be restored. Marcellus returned last. Witnesses recall seeing him step out of the reeds as the sun broke the horizon, his clothing soaked, his expression unreadable. Some said he looked hollowed, as though he had poured out everything inside him during the night. Others said he looked complete, hardened into a figure shaped by purpose rather than chance. He did not flee. He did not hide. He simply walked back to the quarters, his steps measured, his body carrying the weight of whatever had transpired in the darkness. The aftermath of the search sealed the climax's moral weight. Authority no longer possessed the will to enact the usual retribution. The men who returned were too shaken to enforce discipline, and the plantation leadership had collapsed with the superintendent's disappearance. Those who survived the marsh avoided the boundary entirely, refusing to speak of what they had seen or felt. Some left the plantation entirely in the following weeks, deserting their posts. Others drank heavily, or sat for hours at a time staring at the marsh as though expecting something to reemerge. Their silence formed a barrier as impenetrable as the reeds themselves. For the enslaved community, the night of the search became a turning point. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. The threat of the overseers diminished, replaced by a deeper, more complex understanding of power, one rooted not in violence alone, but in resistance, nature, memory, and the blurred lines between human action and something older. Marcellus's role remained a subject of whispered debate. Some viewed him as a protector, one who had sacrificed a part of himself to shield others. Others questioned whether he had gone too far, whether the Marsh's appetite had been fed at too great a cost. Many held both beliefs simultaneously, unable to separate gratitude from unease. The climax closed with a single, haunting observation recorded by an unnamed scribe. The marsh remains quiet now, but not still. It waits. Read alongside the scattered testimonies, the lost bodies, the broken authority, and the figure of Marcellus standing at the threshold of dawn. The statement feels less like a warning than a final truth. The conflict had reached its peak. The forces set into motion had collided, and the plantation, and everyone within it, emerged changed, marked by a night that no record could fully contain. The morning after the catastrophic search marked the beginning of a new, unspoken order on the plantation, an order not declared through directives or punishments, but formed from the silent fractures left in every person who had survived the night. The violence had ceased, yet its residue settled into the environment as tangibly as mist. Routine resumed in appearance only. The bell rang at dawn. The field crews assembled. The overseers appeared at their posts. But each action carried the hollow quality of repetition devoid of conviction. The plantation records from this period show an unusual increase in clerical errors, misplaced entries, and abrupt cancellations of planned tasks, suggesting that even the administrative mind of the estate was functioning through a fog of unsettled nerves. The land itself bore marks of disruption: trampled reeds at the marsh boundary, broken lantern frames half buried in mud, and a section of the patrol path that collapsed entirely after the men attempted to regain footing during their retreat. The environment offered no explanation, only evidence of the night's intrusion and the thin line separating control from collapse. The enslaved community moved through this altered landscape with a mixture of vigilance and contemplation, aware that something fundamental had shifted yet unsure of how to interpret the change. Their bodies carried the usual strain of labor, but their eyes tracked the overseers differently, no longer with pure submission but with cautious analysis. The authority they had endured for years had faltered in a way previously unthinkable, revealing its dependence on structures that were more fragile than the overseers themselves had believed. Still, fear lingered. The night had taken lives, including those of the enslaved who never returned from the marsh, and the weight of these losses tempered any sense of triumph. Grief mingled with unease, creating an undercurrent that ran through the quarters like a slow-moving river, a recognition that survival had required choices not all could accept, and that the marsh had claimed more than oppressors. The shared silence at night grew heavier, punctuated only by soft footsteps or the distant sounds of the marsh settling back into its rhythms. The surviving patrolmen and overseers exhibited symptoms that, in modern terms, would be understood as trauma. Contemporary reports describe them as unfit for discipline, unsteady, or prone to agitation, with several refusing to return to any task near the marsh boundary. Their accounts of the night, fragmented, inconsistent, embroidered with fear, were collected and then quietly suppressed by the estate manager, whose priority had shifted from punishing rebellion to preserving whatever remained of the plantation's operational capabilities. One overseer resigned outright, abandoning his post after a week of sleeplessness. Another suffered what was described as a sudden trembling sickness, leaving him unable to grasp tools or reins. These reactions, though rarely acknowledged in official documents, signaled the collapse of the plantation's confidence. The chain of authority had fractured not from external attack, but from internal disintegration, a psychological unraveling that made further retaliation nearly impossible. Marcellus's position within this newly formed silence became both central and obscured. He continued his labor without notable deviation, moving through his tasks with the same steady control that had defined his presence long before the conflict escalated. Yet those who observed him closely reported subtle changes, a withdrawal into thought, a stillness during rest periods that suggested not calm, but calculation, and a tendency to linger near the marsh boundary at dusk as though assessing something unseen. His actions toward others became more deliberate. He intervened quietly when tensions flared among workers, stepping between disputes with a gravity that discouraged escalation without ever asserting overt authority. Some interpreted this as leadership. Others saw it as the behavior of a man trying to manage the consequences of his own decisions. What remained certain was that his knowledge of the marsh had granted him a kind of influence no punishment could strip away, and that influence now operated within a fragile equilibrium shaped by fear, respect, and unresolved questions. Rumors spread in multiple directions at once, forming conflicting narratives that reflected the anxieties of those who repeated them. Among the enslaved, one version held that the marsh had chosen Marcellus as its instrument, allowing him passage and taking only those whose cruelty warranted removal. Another insisted that he acted entirely of his own volition, using the landscape's dangers with a precision learned over years of observation. A third, more cautious account suggested that he had attempted to minimize deaths, but could not control the panic once it began. These interpretations evolved into whispered lessons passed from adult to child in the quarters, shaping a memory network that served as both warning and consolation. In contrast, the few remaining overseers blamed the marsh alone, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of human strategy behind their ordeal. Their denial became a protective narrative, shielding them from the deeper realization that one man had outmaneuvered an entire system designed to crush him. The estate's financial records from the months following the incident reveal the long-term consequences with bureaucratic clarity. Productivity declined as oversight weakened. Repairs were delayed due to labor shortages among supervisors. Extra expenses were logged for hiring outside men to patrol the perimeter, though these replacements often quit within days after hearing stories from the survivors. Insurance notes mention dangerous environmental conditions, but omit any reference to rebellion. Taken together, these documents indicate an operation slowly degrading from within, its structural integrity compromised by psychological fear rather than material damage. The marsh, which had always been seen as an obstacle, had become a presence the plantation's leadership feared to engage with, altering the balance of power without altering its own nature. In the quarters, the question of justice versus vengeance took on a more intimate dimension. The deaths of enslaved men who had been caught in the marsh during the search weighed heavily on the community. Their absence lingered in the nightly gatherings, in the empty spaces where they once sat, in the stories that ceased mid-sentence because no one remained who could finish them. These losses complicated any sense that the marsh had delivered righteous judgment. Some believed the sacrifices had been necessary, the price of dismantling a cruelty that had defined their world for generations. Others felt that no liberation, however symbolic, could justify the death of their own. This moral ambivalence settled over Marcellus most heavily, though he spoke of it to no one. His solitude deepened in the weeks that followed, his figure often seen at the edge of the fields, watching the marsh with an expression that witnesses described not as regret or triumph, but as something more burdened, an awareness that action taken for survival could still inflict wounds that would not heal easily. As the season turned, the plantation's routines adjusted to the new reality. Fewer patrols ventured near the marsh. Tasks that once required groups of enslaved workers under armed supervision now proceeded with minimal oversight, not out of trust, but out of fear among the overseers. The enslaved community used this reduced surveillance carefully, increasing their networks of quiet cooperation, sharing food and information with a freedom previously impossible. Yet they avoided overt celebration. The memory of the night remained too raw, its lessons too ambiguous. They understood that the system could reassert itself at any moment, driven by reinforcements from other estates or decisions from distant authorities who knew nothing of the Marsh's temperament. Their cautiousness reflected an understanding that transformation rarely arrives in a single decisive moment. Instead, it unfolds gradually, shaped by the interplay of resistance and circumstance. Marcellus's fate, as recorded through scattered testimonies and a single later deleted ledger entry, diverges into two possible outcomes. One account suggests he remained on the plantation for years, guarding a fragile stability and ensuring that no new overseer attempted the brutalities of the past. Another claims he vanished into the marsh one morning before dawn, leaving behind a bundle of tools and a length of rope neatly coiled by the boundary. This version, repeated most often in later oral histories, holds that he became part of the landscape, living in hidden pockets of the marsh or moving between distant communities with knowledge only a few possessed. Whether he left to protect others from retaliation, to escape the moral weight of his actions, or because the marsh called him in ways no human place could equal, remains unknown. The ambiguity enhances his legacy rather than diminishing it. What is certain is that long after the plantation declined, long after the fields were abandoned and the buildings collapsed into disuse, the story of Marcellus and the night of the Great Search persisted. Travelers passing near the marsh heard fragments of it from local families. Historians pieced together its outline from mismatched documents. Descendants of the enslaved carried its moral complexity in stories that questioned not only oppression but the cost of resisting it. In these accounts, Marcellus is neither hero nor villain, neither martyr nor avenger, but a figure caught at the intersection of survival and consequence. A man who used the only power available to him in a world designed to break him, and who carried the burden of that power as heavily as the fear it inspired in others. In this final form, the narrative of the marsh and the plantation stands as a testament to the thin margins within which the oppressed were forced to make decisions. It reveals the instability of systems built on domination, the fragility of authority when confronted with environments and people it does not understand, and the moral uncertainty that accompanies acts of resistance. The marsh remains the silent witness to all of this, neither condemning nor absolving, simply continuing its slow, patient existence. The legacy of that night, preserved through memory and record, challenges any simple interpretation, inviting reflection on the nature of justice, the elasticity of human endurance, and the cost of choosing action in a world that has denied one the right to choose anything at all.